I wanted to ask you a question about supply chains. Your specialty is geopolitics. We've seen a very tense relationship between the United States and China this year in particular. In some industries, there have been hints of companies wanting to move their supply chains, or at least the major transformation that determines country of origin of a good, out of China. Do you see that happening in luxury goods, or really aspirational goods, because the true luxury goods, the final transformation tends to take place in Europe, but do you see that happening in consumer goods, or only in maybe sort of higher tech, more sensitive goods, aerospace and so forth? Please.
Sure. Thank you, Keith. I mean, look, we're meeting at a moment of truth in the overall economic relationship between China and the United States and China and the West. We're sitting here right between the US midterms and the President Trump's meeting with President Xi in Buenos Aires later this month. And I think what will answer that question is really what will this future form of the US-China economic relationship take? I think if you look back at the last 2 years, it has been, certainly for Beijing, in many ways a bewildering period, trying to understand what is the form of economic and security relationship that the United States wants with China, and how can they negotiate their way to it. And I think they've been faced with two fundamental challenges, one in a way more serious than the other, and certainly more long-term. The first was how to deal with this new president who came into office with a fundamental view that China had had too good a deal for too long with the United States. And how would the redress take form? And I think you've seen in all the debates coming out of Washington between the various kinds of economic policymakers and trade policymakers, this increased push on China, trying to make sure that it becomes a different balance and a different relationship going forward. I think what Beijing has found more surprising, and why we're still at a point today where there is no visibility really on what the final deal will look like, if there is going to be a deal, is that the big picture that China missed was that alongside this populist politician who came to power thinking about all the ways in which Chinese manufacturing and Chinese trade and IP policies had, in his view and the view of many, had too good a deal with the United States, there is a broader underlying sense across political divide in the United States. And you can have this conversation on the Hill, you can have it everywhere in Washington, and in the corporate world as well, that this is a moment to reset the economic relationship with the United States. And I think that has been the much bigger surprise for China. So when you look at the way in which China has had to try to plan for this next phase of the relationship, I think fundamentally the assumption still is that what the United States is looking for, and what Donald Trump in particular is looking for, is simply a better margin in the business of the United States with China. If you think about it, basically the kind of margin compression that Donald Trump is looking for is thinking basically China's had a very good business for a very long time in the United States, maybe running at a 50 or 60% margin, pick your number. This margin now needs to come down. It needs to come down to 30%, 20%, again, pick your number. The important part here is that Donald Trump is still looking for a good deal, is still looking for a future of an economic integration with China. And I think the real challenge for China is not can we get a deal with Donald Trump, but their recognition increasingly that Trump may be the last US president who will do a kind of deal that they're looking for, because underlying is a much bigger shift in the view of the United States in its economic relationship with China. If you look at the supply chain shift that has happened already, you're seeing certainly in consumer electronics, Chinese manufacturers and Chinese companies, first of all, now meeting a pretty blanket no to selling a lot of their products directly from China to the United States, and moving some of their manufacturing to Brazil, to Mexico, and other places from which to sell into the United States. I think that will continue in those sectors. Whether it moves into other sectors, I think still is a question of where the economic and trade relationship lands. And I think we still don't know the answer to that. I think we're going to get to one answer by the end of this year. The Chinese clearly were waiting for the midterms. Donald Trump was waiting for the midterms. I think we're going to see the shape of the US economy. What are the signs of a hiking rate environment? What will that do to inflation? What will that do to the overall strength of the US economy? But while the form, I think, of this economic future relationship is still unclear, what every business, I think, has to get used to is that there is still a strong and fundamental view in US business that a future economic relationship with China is essential, is existential, but it will be on different terms. We are not going towards an economic Cold War. I genuinely don't believe that. But we're going to go to a new equilibrium at a different price point, at a different margin between the United States and China. And that is one where, frankly, a lot of the supply chain shift that was happening anyway for competitiveness reasons will continue, and that the marginal shifts will happen more as a function of where this trade relationship gets negotiated.